Behold the Lamb, behold the Lamb, slain from the foundation of the world.
In our last conference, we discussed that great question out of which all religion evolves, the question that is indelibly implanted on the minds and the souls of each human being that's born, and from which all religion comes: what kind of God is God? If God exists, and what does God expect of me, if anything? I think it's really important to give some very, very serious consideration to what we hear around us that people are saying about what kind of God God is and what God expects. I think it's very important to give it consideration in order to match it up with what Jesus says. Because it's what Jesus says is what counts for us who are called by Him. I remember several years ago, I was driving my car to give a talk at Cornell University in the southern part of New York State. And the radio was on, and I heard a syndicated radio commentator by the name of Paul Harvey start off his program by saying that the United States had to increase its nuclear arsenal. It had to increase its nuclear arsenal, needed more nuclear weapons, because American mothers were not having enough children. They were not, therefore, keeping up with the Asian hordes. And you either fight wars by technology or with people, and if you don't have the people, you have to have the technology. And therefore, there was a need for America, if it wished to keep its standard of living, to increase its nuclear arsenal. At the end of that particular program, he asked his audience to write to their congressmen or congresswomen so that they would pass a prayer amendment to the Constitution of the United States that would let children pray in public schools. You can't do that in the United States. Now, I use that little story to tell you that is my judgment. I don't want my children praying to the same God as Paul Harvey's children, if Paul Harvey's children believe as he does. Because Paul Harvey is praying to an idol. Paul Harvey believes there's a God that wants, first of all, nuclear weapons in existence, that justifies their existence and their use. No such God is known to me by Jesus. Secondly, he believes that the United States should keep its standard of living. Over 50% of what is in the United States for its standard of living comes from the blood and sweat of child labor in third world countries, Latin America, Southeast Asia. So I don't believe in that God that Paul Harvey's talking about. What he's talking about is an idol. Doesn't exist. Not if Jesus is the revealer of the true God, the God who is mercy and the God who wants mercy. The economy of the United States, as of Europe, as of all first world countries, is built on a brutal mercilessness towards women, children, the poor of the third world. It is estimated in the third world that there are 100 million children between the ages of 4 and 12 who are working in sweatshops to make goods for the first world. Us. I don't believe God wants that. I don't believe God wants that standard of living. And I don't believe God wants us to defend that by the mass homicide slaughter of war. In other words, I don't want to pray with a person who is praying to a bloody idol. 40 years ago, a little more, Dwight Eisenhower, when he was running for President of the United States, used to close a lot of his speeches with the same sentence. He used to say, I don't care what kind of God you believe in, just so long as you believe in God. I don't care what kind of God you believe in, just so long as you believe in God. Like so many other things that politicians say, it sounds profound, but it's actually just so much drivel. It makes no sense at all. Can you imagine Jesus saying, I don't care what kind of God you believe in, just so long as you believe in God? Nonsense. The whole great issue that everyone is struggling with is precisely what kind of God you believe in. It makes all the difference in the world, whether it's a God of mercy or a God of mercilessness. Whether it's a Catholic God in the sense of it's the God who's Father and loves all people, or whether it's a parochial God, only a God that loves our group. Whether it's a God that says it's all right to live off child labor, or whether it's a God that says it's an abomination to live off child sweatshop labor. There's almost nothing that God hasn't been used to justify. You probably all remember and know that on the belt buckles of Hitler's army, every single person in Hitler's army, their belt buckle contained the German words, Gott mit uns, God with us. There is no limit to what God can be used for. The great issue still remains. What kind of God is God if God exists? And what does God expect, if anything? We all know that the answer to that question, the answers that have been given to that question over the centuries have been many. Some say God is evil. For example, they look at all the suffering and death in the world and they say God just does it. God is an evil principle. Others say God is indifferent to the world. He just creates it and then lets it run like a machine, kind of deus ex machina. Others say that God is just a God that wants people to perform liturgical rites and cult properly. And as long as they do that, he doesn't care how they live. And so the answers are uncountable as to how people have responded to the question, what kind of God is God if God exists? And what does he expect of me, if anything? I would like to offer you today, this morning, a reflection from the teachings of Jesus about what God expects. The reflection comes from the 25th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. It is the famous Last Judgment passage. There is no question that this is the teaching of Jesus. Not necessarily his exact words, but this is his teaching. Scripture scholars are agreed. We all know the passage, but I just want to read it to you because in terms of what we're doing this morning and have been doing and will do, it's so important. In terms of your own lives, my life, the life of everyone on the planet, it is a terribly important passage. It reads, when the Son of Man comes in his glory, escorted by all the angels, then will he take his seat on his throne of glory. All the nations will be assembled before him. He will separate people one from another, as a shepherd separates sheep from goats. He will place the sheep on his right hand and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right hand, come, you of my Father who are blessed. Take your heritage in the kingdom prepared for you since the foundation of the world. For I was hungry and you gave me to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me to drink. I was a stranger and you made me welcome, naked and you clothed me, sick and you visited me, in prison and you came to see me. Then the virtuous will say to him in reply, Lord, where did we see you hungry and feed you, thirsty and give you to drink? Where did we see you a stranger and make you welcome, naked and clothe you, sick or in prison and go to see you? And the king will answer, I tell you solemnly, insofar as you did this to one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you did it to me. Next he will say to those on his left, go away from me with your curse upon you, to the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry and you did not give me food. I was thirsty and you did not give me to drink. I was a stranger and you never clothed me, never welcomed me, naked and you never clothed me, sick and in prison and you never visited me. Then they in their turn will ask, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty, a stranger, naked, sick, or in prison, and did not come to your help? And he will answer and say, I tell you solemnly, insofar as you neglected to do this to one of the least of these, you neglected to do it to me. And they will go away to eternal punishment, and the virtuous to eternal life. Now it has been a very serious problem in the history of all the Christian churches, a very serious pastoral problem, a problem of guiding souls, that people have been told about many, many things that will or will not interfere with the attaining eternal salvation. But too often and too consistently over the history of all the churches, the very thing that Jesus talks about that brings people to salvation and that interferes with salvation is totally ignored. Namely, mercy. All kinds of rules are set up to follow and to obey and so forth and so on. You can listen to the Protestant preachers on the radio and television on Sunday morning in America. And every one of them is saying this and that is going to send people to hell and this and that. But no one talks about mercy or the lack of mercy. Now let's get something straight right from the beginning. You are a human being. I am. It is your prerogative, your right to accept or reject the understanding of what kind of God God is and what God expects that Jesus tells us. Just like it's your prerogative as a human being to accept or to reject Jesus as the Messiah, the Christ, the Son of the living God. However, what you cannot do, what is impossible to do, is you cannot accept the person and reject the teaching. This has been the history of Christianity for far too long. Accepting the person of Jesus and ignoring his teachings. You can't do that, because if Jesus is the Messiah, the Christ, the Son of the living God, if he is the one who comes to judge the living and the dead, he is the one who knows the standard of judgment. And if he says something is the standard of judgment at the end of time, he knows. But he knows more than that, because if he says this kind of activity is the standard of judgment at the end of time, what he is really saying is this kind of activity is how you should live moment to moment. If he says whether you've been merciful or merciless is going to determine your eternity, what he is saying is be merciful moment to moment to moment. The standard that we have at the end of time is the standard we should be living by in the present. Matthew 25, the last judgment passage, negatively says this in one sentence. It says, apathy, indifference to suffering. Apathy in the face of relievable human misery is radical evil. Indifference to human suffering, indifference to human suffering is radical evil. You see, what Jesus says is this. Remembering now that the biblical notion of judgment is not that God sits there like a district court judge, but we judge ourselves. We become as we do. We become as we think. We become as we choose. And if a person, as I used the example in the last conference, if a person drinks a quart of whiskey every day for 15 years, and the DTs occur, the snakes come over the top of the bed at night, that's not God sending the snakes over. That's a consequence of choice. And what Jesus is saying in Matthew 25 is this: mercilessness, indifference to human suffering, apathy has terrible consequences in the human soul. Terrible consequences. You know, in the passage of Matthew 25, Jesus uses the word, depending upon how you translate it, hell or eternal damnation, And there's no way to take that out because it's actually there. Now, maybe we should stop a minute and think about this. First of all, how does the word hell function in human life, in human language? Well, you know, some people have an image of hell that's anthropomorphic. You know, the devil with the pitchfork and the fire. Other people have an image of hell that's psychological, like being trapped in a nightmare for all eternity that you can't get out of. Other people have an image of hell. The Anglican Church just published something along these lines. Other people have an image of hell that's called ontological. That is, that God is being, and if you do things enough against God, you literally annihilate yourself forever. But whatever image people have, it's wrong. Because it is only an image about a reality that we have no contact with as human beings. We use an image to point, but we don't know the reality. The image is no more hell than the sign Dublin is Dublin, the road sign. However, the word hell functions this way in human language. Hell is the word that human beings use to say that a certain kind of activity is so contrary to the nature of God, so contrary to the nature of the universe that God made, so contrary to the nature of human beings, that that activity results in eternal negativity. Eternal negativity. That an activity is so contrary to the nature of God, to the nature of the universe, and to the nature of being a human being, that if you participate in that activity, you wind up in a situation of eternal negativity somehow. And that's what Jesus says about indifference to human suffering. Indifference to human suffering. Apathy in the face of relievable human misery is radical evil, he says. For you cannot get any more radical in terms of evil than to say that a particular act puts you in hell. And that's what Jesus says about indifference to human suffering. Now you listen to the preachers here and there and everywhere, and you read the sermons, over the centuries of the great preachers, not just Catholic, but Orthodox and Protestant. And they are loaded with warnings and statements and so forth that are going to send people to hell. But I tell you, they are almost devoid of any discussion about what Jesus says results in eternal negativity. Mercilessness, indifference to pain, apathy, towards misery. Hardly a word exists in the great sermons of the world. Everything, almost everything that you can think of. From not, I assure you, Christian preachers, for example, for centuries talked about being sent to hell if you didn't go out and fight for your country. Literally, go out and kill for your country, you would be sent to hell. That's part of Christian preaching for centuries. And you know as well as I do, because you have lived, how you have heard this sermon and that sermon, you know? The sermon delivered so eloquently that you actually felt your feet burning in the church. But never a word about what Jesus says is the problem. Indifference to human suffering. Always something else. Always some other standard. Always some other rule. But Jesus says there is something about indifference to suffering that changes a person so badly that if he or she persists in it, there is a danger of eternal negativity. In other words, you think of the story of the Good Samaritan. Remember the story? The man is on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he's beaten up and he's robbed. And first the priest goes by him and sees him, and then just travels on. Then the Levite comes, and he sees the man on the side of the road, and he too travels on. And then the Samaritan comes, and he helps him. The enemy of the Jew, he helps him. Jesus tells this story. Now you know and I know, the priest probably came along, saw the man on the side of the road and began to think, gee, if I help him, maybe there's robbers here. This is a setup. They'll rob me, you know. Well, I've got a sermon to deliver down at the synagogue or whatever the case may be. What will happen to me, if I help him? The Levite comes along and he says the same thing. What will happen to me if I stop and I'm robbed helping him and he beats me up and I lose my money? And the Samaritan comes along and he helps him. Because the Samaritan did not say, what will happen to me if I stop and help? He said, what will happen to him if I don't stop and help? The Samaritan's concern was he knew there was another human being there suffering. And if he didn't stop, what would happen to that other human being? The other two were trying to save their life in this world. What will happen to me? And so they left him in his suffering. And so I'm raising in front of you this morning an issue. And the issue is this: that God comes to us in Jesus and tells us that at the end of time, the standard is going to be, I was hungry and you gave me to eat, I was thirsty and you gave me to drink, etc. Basically, I was in need and you helped me. The standard is going to be whether we were merciful or merciless. What is being said is, if we are merciful, every deed of mercy creates us, builds us, fills us with the life of God, who is mercy. And every merciless deed empties us of that life. Empties us of that life. This is a little, I'll just read this to you, because it's something that was in Time magazine. It's only one little paragraph. And it's about college students, It's about college students, and it's just one little paragraph that might make a point. It says, the loudest noise on campus now is the grind for grades. Corporate recruiters draw record crowds of students, bringing good tidings that there are jobs for June graduates. Student demonstrations are rare, and when they do erupt, the protest is not over some big political issue, but just such things as local tuition increases. Eric Maui of Harvard says, we are definitely apathetic. But it is a beneficial apathy. It's an apathy of satisfaction. We have been through enough for a while. We need a break. Now we can go forth and party without a sense of remorse. Just let me comment on that for a second. Harvard is a Christian college in the United States, a good Christian college with highly intelligent students. And here's a boy that has gone through 4 years of Christian college. He'd be about 21 or 22 years old. And he says, we are definitely apathetic. He's proud of what Jesus says is radical evil. And he comes to a Christian environment. Now, Time magazine isn't picking on Harvard College. I know the Catholic college scene in the United States pretty well, and I can attest to the same thing. Massive indifference to human suffering. Massive indifference. Indistinguishable from the secular colleges. The name of the game is to accumulate talents in order to go out and make money to take care of number one. I am not picking on Eric Maui. I'm not picking on Harvard College. I'm not picking on the Catholic colleges. I am just saying, that this is the structure of reality. That is the structure of consciousness in terms of young people. Listen to Eric's words. But it is a beneficial apathy. It's an apathy of satisfaction. Beneficial to whom? The one person who dies every 9 seconds in this world from starvation? The one person who dies from a disease every 6 seconds because they can't get the money to be inoculated against it? Beneficial to the 100 million children working in sweatshops in the third world? It is an apathy of satisfaction. Who is satisfied? What I'm raising here is this. This young man is 21 years old, 22. He did not create himself. He did not build the institutions he went through, family and school and churches. They were built by the 2 generations before him. That's us. If he is what he is, it's because we made him that way. Do we really care, for example? I remember being here in Ireland. And I remember a young woman took one of my retreats in Ireland back about 6, 7 years ago, 8 years ago. And after the retreat, she thoroughly agreed with what I was saying and so forth and so on. And then she started telling me how delighted she was that her brother had just gotten a job in a company that was making parts for the cruise nuclear missile. No sense that this is an instrument of grotesque mercilessness. And her brother was now about to put 8 hours a day of his life into making an instrument of destruction. An instrument, as Pope Paul VI said, that even if it's never used, is a crime against humanity because it robs the poor of what they need. And that brings us to the issue. We in the first world church, and you are in the first world, and I am in the first world, we have not only developed an ethic that justifies homicide, the mass homicide of war, capital punishment, and so forth. We in the first world church have developed an ethic that justifies apathy. We have developed a way of thinking about Christianity that justifies indifference to human suffering. Now, you will never find a priest or a pastor or a minister get up or a bishop get up and say you can be apathetic. I mean, that would be clearly so contrary to Matthew 25, it couldn't be said. But the way the ethic has been developed is this. First world churches teach an ethic of justified apathy by teaching an ethic, a way of right and wrong, by teaching an ethic that they have a right to pursue the good life for themselves and their families regardless of the source of the good life. In other words, I have a right to pursue the good life for me and for mine. You say, you say, I'm really not that way. I'm just a simple, middle-class, moderate person. Consider this. Consider this. One person dies every 9 seconds in the world from starvation, as we said. We could go on giving the figures of the desperate need human beings are in. And remember, the figures are just statistics. But remember, every child that dies of starvation, there is a mother and father that has to watch it die. There is more than one person suffering. Every person that dies from a disease they could be inoculated against, there are those that love him or her that also suffer. Now, we say, I'm not a person that has a lot of money. I'm not a person that is indifferent to human suffering. I ask you to consider this. How much money every year is spent in Ireland on alcohol in a world where one person dies every 9 seconds? Alcohol is absolutely non-necessary for existence. None. It can't help existence in any way. No one needs it to live. In the United States, for example, it's a business that runs in to the hundreds of billions of dollars a year. In the United States, I haven't looked at the figures in the last 7 or 8 years, but in the United States, the money that's spent on horse, dog, and harness racing is $88 billion a year. We're talking billions here. Just before I came here, a couple of weeks before I came here, I read a statistic in the paper that in the United States last year, $410 billion was spent by people in casino gambling. $410 billion. That's just a little shot of the whole government budget. People go out, literally go out. Average people, middle-class people, and they will spend $80, $90, $100 for tennis shoes. Tennis shoes made in Southeast Asia by a child who's getting 32 cents an hour so they can have high-class tennis shoes. Said another way, how much money is spent on style and fashion? Smoking, cigarettes. Here's the point. In real life, concrete existence, we have 3 things that we use for ourselves or for others. Our mind, our human time, our life's time, and our money. Mind, time, and money. But here is a fact of life. Mind, time, and money that's spent in one direction is mind, time, and money that can never be spent in another direction. Mind, time, and money that's spent for my pleasure is mind, time, and money that can never be used to relieve other people's pain. It's that simple. We didn't create this universe. We didn't create this world, and we didn't create ourselves or others. We are but stewards of the God of mercy. We are stewards of the God of mercy. We have developed a culture of indifference to human suffering. There's plenty of money. There is a funnel of money that is bottomless for war and for luxury and for style and for fashion. But where is the money to help the 100 million children working in sweatshops who produce our cheap goods? You know, many years ago in the United States, there was a famous lady, Catholic lady, and wealthy Catholic lady. And when wealthy people get a divorce, in the United States anyway, this whole thing is usually taken care of by lawyers, and no one sees what really goes on, huh? They file the papers at the end of all kinds of secret proceedings, and everything is done very, very diplomatically, and and so forth. Even though the divorce is a public thing, nothing really gets public because they come to amiable agreements. Well, this particular divorce got kind of saucy, kind of mean. And so instead of it being settled out of court, it went to court. And this particular Catholic lady, whom all of you know, there's no sense mentioning her name. This particular Catholic lady, it was shown in the court documents that the previous year she had spent $10,000 on underwear. $10,000 on underwear. Now, can you imagine, just imagine, in a world where one person dies every 9 seconds, in a world that's a furnace of agony and needs so much help, a person spending $10,000 on underwear. What kind of consciousness does it take in terms of mind and time and money to go and shop for $10,000 worth of underwear? And yet she did. She spent about $40,000 getting her hair done, etc., etc. The danger here is that we start waving a finger at her and start throwing stones. Because which of us is without sin? Which of us in the first world has intentionally and by decision based on faith in Jesus directed his mind or her mind, time and money, to mercy rather than to self-indulgence? I don't mean we're supposed to starve to death. The mind, time, and money that I'm talking about is the luxury mind, time, and money. Not the mind, time, and money you need for clothes to keep you warm, for food and so forth. I'm talking about the mind, time, and money that's not needed for sustenance. I'm not talking about a law or a rule. I'm talking about mercy. I'm not talking about directing it here or there. I'm talking about an identity with suffering people and wanting to help them rather than wanting to have a Guinness. You see, the central symbol of Christianity is the cross. And the cross is a statement, clear as can be, of the postponement of gratification by me so that others can have life. The cross is a cross of mercy. The cross is a symbol of giving up things that I think would be good for me so that others can live. In other words, let me say it this way. Mercy is always an ascetical practice. The asceticism of Christianity is mercy. God has no interest in you suffering through not having an ice cream soda if you want to have an ice cream soda. That's irrelevant. But in order to be merciful, in order to be an artist of mercy, as we talked about last night, in order to be a person of mercy, it means redirecting mind, time, and money out of normal patterns we've had since childhood, secular patterns, that are totally justified by the secular culture, and redirecting that mind, time, and money into responding to human suffering, wherever it might be. Mercy is the Christian form of asceticism. We must sacrifice what we want so that others can have life. We must give up, or give a gift, if you will, of things we could have but don't need in order that others can have things that they absolutely need to live. Said in a simple form, we must set aside our luxury for those who don't have sustenance to live. That's simple. However, when we do that, we become like God. Literally, we become like God. For God is mercy, mercy that sacrifices so others can have life. Look at the newspapers. Look at the television. Look at the stupidity of what's going on there in terms of improving the world. You hear what's said. You see what's written. It's the whole myth of progress that's put out there. You know how that goes. That somehow the one person who dies every 9 seconds from starvation, the one person every 6 seconds, every 6 seconds being raped in prison, the 100 million children out there producing in sweatshops goods for the third world. You know how it goes, the myth of progress, the lie, the propaganda of progress. It says this: progress will come to the poor and the suffering and the oppressed without any sacrifice on my part, without any pain on my part. Progress will come to the suffering of this world without any risk on my part, without any disciplined service to them on my part. Somehow things will get better, the myth goes. Somehow the poor will get richer. Somehow the people in slavery will be moved out of slavery and oppression. Pain will go away. The sick will be healed. The lame will walk. The imprisoned will be free, rehabilitated, healed. Guards will no longer torture prisoners. Everything, progress will come. While I worry about being in fashion, while I worry about the soccer match, while I raise another Guinness, it won't come that way. It won't come that way. We have developed in Christianity, Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant, a very, very unserious attitude towards suffering and towards the fact that God wants it eliminated, responded to. We are very, very unserious about it in the church. We assuage our conscience by saying there's little groups out here and little groups out there that help. That's not what Jesus is talking about. We are not going to be judged on the fact that we gave a few pounds to a little group who's doing good. The question is, at the end of time, I was hungry and you gave me to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me to drink. The question is not for the little group, it's for us to be merciful. It's a most serious problem. But it's not a law. It's not a rule. That's not what's at stake here. It's about participating in the life of God, participating in what Pope John Paul II said in his encyclical Dives et Misericordia, participating in mercy, which is the most stupendous attribute of the Creator and the Redeemer. It is about becoming divinized, becoming holy. Mercy is the road to holiness. It is about ceasing to be merciless, for that is the road to the unholy. That is not of God. We all know, everyone here knows how it's possible to be merciful or merciless just with the tongue. Just with the tongue. There's a real choice at that moment. Whether the tongue is going to be used as an agent of the divinity, or whether the tongue is going to be used for the agent of some other spirit. We all know that we really do have a choice between watching a baseball game and going down to a rest home where elderly people are alone and in need and isolated in pain and just being with them. The opportunities are myriad. There is no end because the world is suffering. So let me say it to you this way and see if it makes any sense this way. What I'm saying to you is human suffering according to Jesus. Human suffering according to Jesus is the most efficacious sacramental in the entire universe. Human suffering is a sacramental. It is a way that we can contact God. Where did we see you? Whatever you did to the least, you did to me. It is a direct contact with God. Identification with people's pain and suffering. Identification with the victim, not with the victor, with the victim. And his pain or her pain and misery is as sure a way as there is on the face of the earth to encounter God, to become holy. Now, as I may have mentioned, we all know how it is possible. We all know how it is possible to ignore human misery and to justify our ignoring it. And in a world in which we live, which is totally secular, it's justified. We live in an economy, basically capitalism, where the fundamental principle is too much is not enough. You are entitled to grab all you can get, as long as it's within the law. But that's not the gospel. The gospel is the other way around. You are stewards of the God of mercy. Everything you have, from your tongue to your money, to your whole person, to every article that you receive, is meant to be an agent of mercy. And when a person is hungry, I assure you, and you hand that person some food, when a person is lonely and in pain and you spend time with them, that person experiences mercy. And as John Paul II said in his encyclical that we read last conference, you are communicating and revealing the Father to him or her. This is not about law and obligations. This is about becoming one thing, a merciful being, by participating in the life of God and choosing not to do that. Look at the amount of time, mind, and money that you and I and our peers spend on entertainment. Television entertainment here. I don't mean going to the theater, maybe that, Constantly being entertained in one form or another. What I'm not saying is that there's anything wrong with entertainment, that there's anything wrong in itself with horse racing or soccer or anything wrong with having a Guinness. What I'm saying is, in a world that is a furnace of agony and where people so desperately need to be responded to, there is a choice whether to go to the horses, have the Guinness, be entertained, or to do something for someone else, to be merciful. The biblical scholar John L. Mackenzie, that I've quoted so often here, says, mercy in the New Testament is God's saving will. Mercy initiates and consummates the process of salvation. Mercy initiates and consummates. It is the alpha and omega of the salvation process, mercy. And that's what God asks us to come into, to be part of. There's a great French priest still alive by the name of Abbé Pierre. And at the end of the Second World War, he saw all the people devastated, and people who would never come back from war in the sense of a mental illness and everything that comes from war. And he began a whole movement called the Emmaus movement, in which people spend their lives building community with the homeless and street people and refugees and so forth. In other words, they just don't feed them. They try to give them human companionship and so forth and so on. But Abbé Pierre's motto is, the Christian takes care of the worst off first. The Christian takes care of the worst off first. There are plenty of people to take care of the rich. Rich can pay for anything they want. But who's going to worry about those who have nothing, the least? And yet that's where Jesus says he is. Whatever you do to the least, you do to me. the Christian takes care of the worst off first, which is awfully close to Mother Teresa. I give to the poor for nothing what only the rich can afford. That's mercy. Again, we are not talking about a law. We are talking about indeed an asceticism. For it is a struggle. It is an effort. There is pain in redirecting mind, time, and money from things that I've grown used to into a merciful life. That is asceticism. But it's an asceticism that builds us into the reality of God. It's an asceticism through which we enter the being of God, which is mercy. The problem is, I can't do it for you, you can't do it for me, and God can't force us to do it. It's either freely done or it can't be done. And all the excuses are there, and we know every one of them, that will justify our not redirecting our mind, time, and money into a life of mercy. Or at least redirecting our excess mind, time, and money into a life of mercy. The mind, time, and money we don't need to work and other things. We know all the excuses. The only question is, are we going to listen to the excuses, or are we going to listen to Jesus, the God of mercy incarnate, who says, I want mercy, who says, blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. I'm not asking you to be an ascetic monk. I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm not asking you to live an abnormal life. Stay right where you are. But what I'm saying to you is, this culture, every culture, has dulled your sense of the suffering of humanity, has dulled your Christian commitment to the reality of mercy. Jesus tells us they should be sharp. We should see suffering and respond as he did in Gethsemane and so many other places. It's always easy to look at, to miss it. It's always easy to bypass it and not see it. I was hungry and didn't see you. But you know and I know that we do have the capacity to be merciful persons, to grow in the life of God. The only question is, will we do it?